As once upon a time she had heard a baby cry, a little baby that was dying. And her soul cried out in agony, for she knew that Peter, too, was dying. And as she stumbled onward, on toward the black forest, she put her face down to Peter and sobbed over and over again his name. "Peter, Peter, Peter." And Peter, joyous and grateful for her love and the sound of her voice even in these moments, thrust out his tongue and caressed her cheek, and the girl's breath came in a great sob as she staggered on. "It's all right now, Peter," she crooned. "It's all right now, baby. He won't hurt you any more, and we're going across the creek to Mister Roger's cabin, and you'll be happy there. You'll be happy." Her voice choked full, and her mother heart seemed to break inside her, just as life had gone out of that other mother's heart when the baby died. For their grief, in God's reckoning of things, was the same, and little Peter, sensing the greatness of this thing that had made them one in flesh and blood, snuggled his wiry face closer in her neck, crying softly to her, and content to die there, close to the warmth of the creature he loved. "Don't cry, baby," she soothed. "Don't cry, Peter dear. It'll soon be all right. All right." And the sob came again into her throat and clung there like a choking fist until they came to the edge of the big forest. She looked down and saw that Peter's eyes were closed, and not until then did the miracle of understanding come upon her fully that there was no difference at all between the dying baby's face and dying Peter's, except that one had been white and soft, and Peter's was different and covered with hair. "God'll take care of you, Peter," she whispered. "He will. God and me, and Mister Roger." She knew there was untruth in what she was saying, for no one, not even God, would ever take care of Peter again, in life. His still little face, and the terrible grief in her own heart, told her that. For Peter's back was broken, and he was going even now, as she ran moaningly with him through the deep aisles of the forest. But before he died, before his heart stopped beating in her arms, she wanted to reach Jolly Roger's friendly cabin in the big swamp beyond the creek. It was not that he could save Peter, but something told her that Jolly Roger's presence would make Peter's dying easier, both for Peter and for her, for in this first glad spring of her existence the stranger in the forest shack had brought sunshine and hope and new dreams into her life, and they had set him up, she and Peter, as they would have set up a god on a shrine. So she ran for the fording place on Sucker Creek, which was a good half-mile above the shack in which the stranger was living. She was staggering and short of wind when she came to the ford, and when she saw the whirl and rush of water ahead of her, she remembered what Jolly Roger had said about the flooding of the creek, and her eyes widened. Then she looked down at Peter, piteously limp and still in her arms, and she drew a quick breath and made up her mind. She knew that at this shallow place the water could not be more than up to her waist, even at the flood tide. But it was running like a mill race. She put her lips down to Peter's fuzzy little face, and held them there for a moment, and kissed him. "We'll make it, Peter," she whispered. "We ain't afraid, are we, baby? We'll make it. Sure, sure, we'll make it." She set out bravely, and the current swished about her ankles, to her knees, to her hips. And then, suddenly, unseen hands under the water seemed to rouse themselves, and she felt them pulling and tugging at her as the water deepened to her waist. In another moment she was fighting to hold her feet, struggling to keep the forces from driving her downstream. And then came the supreme moment, close to the shore for which she was striving. She felt herself giving away, and she cried out brokenly for Peter not to be afraid. And then something drove pitilessly against her body, and she flung out one arm, holding Peter close with the other, and caught hold of a bit of stub that protruded like a handle from the black and slippery log the flood water had brought down upon her. "We're all right, Peter," she cried, even in that moment when she knew she had lost. "We're all right—" And then suddenly the bright glory of her head went down, and with her went Peter, still held to her breast under the sweeping rush of the flood. Even then it was thought of Peter that filled her brain. Somehow she was not afraid. She was not terrified, as she had often been in the flood rush of waters that smashed down the creeks in springtime. An inundating roar was over her, under her, and all about her. It beat in a hissing thunder against the drums of her ears, yet it did not frighten her as she had sometimes been frightened. Even in that black chaos which was swiftly suffocating the life from her, unspoken words of cheer for Peter formed in her heart, and she struggled to hold him to her, while with her other hand she fought to raise herself by the stub of the log to which she clung. For she was not thinking of him as Peter the dog, but as something greater, something that had fought for her that day, and because of her had died. Suddenly she felt a force pulling her from above. It was the big log, turning again to that point of equilibrium which for a space her weight had destroyed. In the edge of a quieter pool where the water swirled but did not rush, her brown head appeared, and then her white face, and with a last mighty effort she thrust up Peter so that his dripping body was on the log. Sobbingly she filled her lungs with air. But the drench of water and her hair blinded her, so that she could not see. And she found all at once that the strength had gone from her body. Vainly she tried to drag herself up beside Peter, and in the struggle she raised herself a little, so that a low-hanging branch of a tree swept her like a mighty arm from the log. With a cry she reached out for Peter. But he was gone. The log was gone, and she felt a vicious pulling at her hair, as Jed Hawkins himself had often pulled it, and for a few moments the current pounded against her body and the tree limb swayed back and forth as it held her there by her hair. If there was pain from that tugging, Nada did not feel it. She could see now, and 30 yards below her was a wide, quiet pool into which the log was drifting. Peter was gone. And then, suddenly, her heart seemed to stop its beating, and her eyes widened, and in that moment of astounding miracle she forgot that she was hanging by her hair in the ugly lip of the flood, with slippery hands beating and pulling at her from below. For she saw Peter in the edge of the pool, making his way toward the shore. For a space she could not believe. It must be his dead body drifting. It could not be Peter swimming. And yet his head was above the water. He was moving shoreward. He was struggling. Frantically she tore at the detaining clutch above her. Something gave way. She felt the sharp sting of it, and then she plunged into the current, and swept down with it, and in the edge of the pool struck out with all her last strength until her feet touched bottom and she could stand. She wiped the water from her eyes, sobbing in her breathless fear, her mighty hope. Peter had reached the shore. He had dragged himself out, and had crumpled down in a broken heap, but he was facing her, his bright eyes wide open and questing for her. Slowly Nada went to him. Until now, when it was all over, she had not realized how helplessly weak she was. Something was turning round and round in her head, and she was so dizzy that the shore swam before her eyes, and it seemed quite right to her that Peter should be alive and not dead. She was still in a foot of water when she fell on her knees and dragged herself the rest of the way to him, and gathered him in her arms again,